Hello, and welcome to Emerging Cyber Threats and Mitigation Strategies for Financial Services in 2023. Today's webinar is sponsored by Picus Security and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I am looking forward to moderating this discussion panel. Now, before we get to today's timely conversation, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session toward the end of the presentation, where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues. But if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we will provide further technical assistance. Now, second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources, and I'd especially like to call your attention to a white paper on key threats and cyber risks facing financial services and banking firms in 2023. You can get a lot of information around some of the things that we'll be talking about today, like top threats, challenges, and requirements for financial organizations. There's also a link for getting started with Picus Security in that handout section, so I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and your colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The other terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom of the handouts there and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters, and to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. After the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's important topic. So financial services firms invest millions of dollars in their cybersecurity every year, and they're among the most resilient organizations in the world. But despite this, many still find it hard to improve the ongoing effectiveness of their security controls and measure the ROI of their security programs. So what we're going to talk about today is how to stay secure in an ever-evolving landscape, how to mitigate risks, and how to safeguard your most valuable asset. So we'll cover some of the challenges that financial services face to become resilient against cyber attacks. We'll go into the emerging cyber threats faced by financial institutions in 2023, such as ransomware, phishing, and insider threats based on recent incident data. And we'll spend some time on how to make more data-driven security decisions and get the best value from your investment by implementing continuous threat exposure management. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel today. These three gentlemen are the perfect guests to talk about all these topics and more. So we have Crit Golden, who's head of solutions architects at Picus, and Crit's had a distinguished career in security engineering, including senior roles at Simulate and Mandiant. Next, we've got an expert who's at the center of securing the financial industry. That's Fernando Leitao, who's cybersecurity advisory director for MasterCard. And in that role, he's establishing MasterCard's cybersecurity advisory practice for the Americas. This is a service that's going to help MasterCard's clients identify threats and risks, strengthen awareness, and the human element of the cybersecurity chain, and identify and defend against most relevant threats with breach attack simulations. And then we have Lester Cheng, who's a cyber and crisis management exercise consultant. And Lester has extensive experience in conducting exercises and establishing large-scale exercise programs in the financial sector as well as the military. He's participated as the head representative in multinational security exercises and has also orchestrated enterprise-wide live exercises. So what a great panel. Let's bring everybody up on camera here. Well, thanks all of you guys for being here. This is going to be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. Let's dig right into it. So, you know, finance continues to be the industry that's most heavily targeted by cyber criminals. And Fernando, I wanted to ask you to start with, why do firms remain such a prime target?
Sure, Scott. So look, we know that is an ever ever-changing threat landscape, right? So things are evolving on both sides, right? On the companies, on new technologies, also limited resources, to implement security measures and fight the threats. But it's really, really complicated. On top of that, I think what's been happening the past years and now accelerated by companies going further on their digital transformation journeys and agile ways of doing things. We can enumerate a lot of factors here, as well as you know we know this huge dependence on third parties, and everybody knows that this is also a huge pain point. But I also want to highlight, Scott, that it the, it's a huge target, right? So cyber criminals, they are looking after what is valuable in the market, and those companies, they do hold certain business assets that are very important, right? Financials, information, PII, you name it, right? So that's why I believe they continue to be such a huge target in the market these days.
Yeah, those are great points, Fernando. You've really hit a lot of it. I want to pose a similar question to Crit. What factors make the job of security teams in finance particularly challenging?
Scott, thank you for the question. Being in finance, period, is difficult, right? It's a high volume environment, but there are a lot of competing attentions, right, in a finance group, and it's often in an undersized team. That makes it very difficult to prioritize and understand your threat readiness at any given point in time. The attacker landscape is ever changing, right? It's very dynamic and fluid. The volume of attacks is ever prevalent and growing every single day. Complicated legislation and regulations and the pressure to be proactive and accurate is at an all-time high. So it's a high pressure environment. And not to mention the financial industry is heavily targeted because it's a high value return for the attacker. So they're probably the number one attacked vector that I see across the board. And it's not changing. This fact is increasing every day. Our data shows that the finance industry is likely the most targeted vertical. More new attacks are targeted against finance than any others. And using point in time solutions or point in time assessments to try and stay abreast of that security posture and that security awareness, our risk profile is extremely complicated in that particular vertical.
I like that, Crit. And, I think something that both you and Fernando touched on there is, I guess another way to phrase that high value of return is the old adage about asking the bank robber why he robs banks. And the answer, of course, is that's where the money is. So
That's right.
Lester, how does the size of the task defending organizations in the financial sector compare to that in other industries?
So yeah, thanks for the question. I think we look at it from a attacker's perspective. Banks employ a lot of people, and if people are a vector into the infrastructure, then the threat surface expands. So that's one way to look at it. There are more opportunities there from a uh, attack surface perspective. And like what was mentioned, the banks serve a lot of people as well, and that's where the impact can be multiplied very quickly. And I think the other complication is banks tend to be it's a double-edged sword. They tend to be at the forefront of technology, and that's where the technology stack grows sometimes too quickly for security teams liking. And therefore all these factors make it a difficult beast to protect. Yeah, so it's a with your increase in influence, you will draw unwanted attention definitely.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So You guys have all established what a big challenge it is to defend systems in the financial sector. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of understanding threat readiness. So, Crit, maybe I'll direct this one to you. What are some of the attack trends in the finance industry that you've been tracking?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. There's quite a few, right? But it's some very interesting information. Pickus publishes a red report each year, which really it covers the latest trends from the attackers. We understand the landscape and what attackers are doing and what is happening in these campaigns. And there's some very interesting findings. Attacks we know are more targeted today than they've ever been before. In the past, it's always been the kind of a rinse and repeat, the same old attack. It works. We didn't have the tools. We weren't very good at security and prevention. And so they could just reuse it over and over and over. But today we see more multi-purpose malware, and we see it that it's more sophisticated and evasive than ever. We're seeing in the Pickus Red Report an interesting fact that there's an average of 11 actions per malware on average. That's a dramatic increase over the last few years. So tools need to be more sophisticated to catch the malware today. A third of all the malware now leverages more than 20 TTPs. Think about that. That's a staggering amount. That's a third of all new malware today leverages more than 20 TTPs. And a tenth of that, the malware employs almost 30 TTPs. We also see lateral movement is on the rise with new techniques, as well as some of the tried and true techniques that have always been around. Some of the newcomers on the list this year are T1021, which is remote services. Another technique, T1018, remote service discovery. Those are primarily used for lateral movement. And we're also seeing a new technique, Windows management instruction, that's abused by attackers to execute files and commands on multitudes of remote systems. So not only more multi-layered malware, but more sophisticated malware and new techniques come out. Ransomware, unfortunately, is a common and increasingly top-tier threat to the finance industry as well as all other finances. And that's typically because of the ease of infection and the valuable return if indeed they're successful. So ransomware is not going anywhere as well. And I would say probably the one piece that's changed from the threat landscape lately is identity and credentials really are your new perimeter. It's all about the credentials, right? Credential dumping is on the rise as well this year. Lateral techniques are on the rise as well. So it's an ever-growing, sophisticated landscape that we have to defend against in the finance industry today.
Kurt, that was a great list, and in the sense that great can be terrible. That's really scary stuff, especially that 11 actions per malware on average. That's amazing. I mean, that's so sophisticated. Um, Fernando, with that list in mind, what are the threats that security leaders in finance are most concerned about?
Yeah, Scott, I agree with Creed, right? So we serve a multitude of clients, and especially in the financial services industry, and here in NEM, we have to know what's happening in the market. So just looking for, let's say, the past 12 months, we see a huge prevalence of ransomware, as Creed mentioned, malwares, right? Also email phishing, but I also think it's important to understand who are those threat actors, right? As Crit mentioned, those attack methods are very, very sophisticated, right? So because they are performed by very organized folks, right? Including state-sponsored attacks sometimes. So I think having this visibility on who are your enemies, right? So what type of attack methods are happening, you know? And on top of that, understanding also which business assets they are focusing on. So we'll help you to drive your defense, because end of the day, this is what we're trying to find, right? Countermeasures, and those countermeasures need to be aligned with your threat intel and what's happening today in the market, if that makes sense.
Does make sense.
Yeah. Um, Lester, any thoughts there? As far as what Fernando was saying, what's your perspective on the threats that security leaders in finance are most concerned about?
Yeah. So I think if you look recently, I think the rise of DDoS impacting national banks, uh, the federal banks, especially in Europe, I think that's a large concern. And the brings back to what Fernando said. The threat actor has certain objectives in mind, and if it's to disrupt critical infrastructure, then finance is one of the largest critical infrastructure to impact the economy, and even the confidence that the country has in its own ability to defend national infrastructure. So I think that has, especially over last year, been increasingly concerning to the private sector or private banks, because once your national infrastructure, your payment systems get impacted, it's going to flow throughout the entire economy. And I think um, that's where it's, I wouldn't say new, but that's where it has been more and more common over the last year, and we all know why.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, so Crit, in light of that, in your experience, are security teams well placed to defend against the threats that they're facing?
That's a $1 million question, Scott, and it's not easy to answer. But let me tell you what I see in the market. Being in the breach and attack simulation space for the last 8 years and assessing an enormous amount of companies, I think we have confident teams and competent teams. But quite honestly, the problem is we're still very reactive. What do I mean by that? We're focusing on tools and deployments and policies and processes more than thinking like an attacker. We're on the reactive. We deploy tools and we sit back, and unfortunately, we kind of wait and see if we get breached. We don't practice our craft today in the enterprise. We practice everything in life, but we don't practice cyber very well. We're kind of expected to show up on breach day and win the game, if you will. So, despite having a large investment in a lot of tools, and Gartner calls this out as well, right? You can invest in a lot of tools. It doesn't make you more secure. And they invest in their security programs. They still struggle determining how effective their controls are at mitigating attacks, common attacks, even not even the sophisticated attacks we're talking about, but common attacks in the wild. The volume of attacks is increasing every single day, and it forces companies really to take a new approach. No longer will the point in time assessment satisfy this need for data and evidence. You need a continuous program, a constant challenging of your environment to really quantify what your risk is and understand what your security posture is for the organization. A lot of controls without being able to validate them is very frustrating. How do I report on that ROI to the business? How do I ascertain if my spend is working as expected? And so there's a big pressure today to define those types of programs, to gather that type of evidence. And we're not talking subjective data, we're talking empiric data, right? Evidence to understand what my posture is, how we can perform before I'm breached. That's not the time for a litmus test, right? So we can practice our craft, but we have to have an organizational focus on the need to be proactive, not just reactive. Standing up tools will not make you secure. You must exercise those tools. You must challenge them and force them to be tuned to do the job properly.
Well, that's a great opportunity to steer the conversation into what security leaders can do to improve visibility and measure risk. I'll ask Fernando, in what ways does an inability to measure readiness and risk impact, or to measure readiness and risk impact security leaders in their teams?
Well, Scott, I think impacts in every aspect, right? So if you don't know where you are, right, it's really challenging to planning for the future and what's coming, right? We were talking during the session about all this challenging threat landscape. So you really need to understand where you are today. And number two, I think it make even more difficult to get the necessary attention, funds, budget, like for improving cybersecurity programs, investing in the right places, against the right threats. So it's really a difficult scenario. And when you think about exposure, right, it certainly led their businesses, much more exposed to threats and things that could be easily sometimes remediated, identified and remediated. But I do agree with Crit, right? So having an approach, not just a software or product, but really a combined approach in regards to identifying risks, quantifying the potential impact to the business, prioritizing the improvements that will help security leaders of today, and their teams to be successful, right? And really understand if the capabilities they have today are addressing the current threat landscape of today and the forecasting. Okay.
Yeah, those are really good points. In crit, how can security leaders seek to achieve greater operational resilience?
I get asked that from CISOs every week, right? What's the best approach? What's the best path? Quite honestly, and I hate to make it sound overly simplified, but you can only understand your current threat readiness. You can only truly quantify your risk and begin that process through validation, through having a foundational approach to what my tools and my programs are capable of. Can I defend against the latest APT group? Can I stop ransomware? I purchase tools to do a job. I must validate that not only my people, but my process and my technology all work seamlessly together to defend the organization, right? I must block, detect, log, and prevent, and alert, and do that effectively and efficiently at volume and scale in order to keep up with the threat landscape. Don't just go out and buy new tools, but understand the effectiveness of the ones you currently have. Maximize their potential and capability. Don't be reactive, as I spoke about earlier before. Be proactive and challenge your organization safely before you're attacked in production to see how you can respond. You can know the answers to the test, quite frankly, is the way I like to put it, before the attacker comes knocking on your door. Is it cheating to have answers to the test? Not in cybersecurity. If we can shortcut that process and know beforehand, we'll be better off for it. One of the biggest problems today is security drift, Scott, to be honest with you. Things in our environments change and affect our security posture without our knowledge. We're not aware of it. So we may be confident day one. How are we 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months down the road? Are you still as confident? If you're using point in time assessments, that gives you a false sense of security of where you may be as attacks morph daily. So leveraging, quite frankly and simply, leveraging a breach and attack simulation tool to begin validating what your controls can do, what your people can do, and are your policies and processes written properly, and do it continually, is how you start to wrap your arms around that in a very foundational nature.
I like that. The concept of is it cheating? And absolutely not. It's like the job description. You need to have the answers beforehand. And the other thing is that security drift is such an important concept because when people can buy SaaS applications for their departments on their credit card, your environment is changing all the time. Yeah.
That's right.
Lester, what's your perspective on achieving greater operational resilience? How security leaders can do that?
Yeah. So I think firstly, understanding your environment, I think that's really important. And because especially the financial sector, the environment is huge. You most likely only have a very myopic view of what you're trying to defend. And not knowing the entire scope of where the actor can enter from is going to leave a huge gap in your monitoring tools, and it also leads to complacency that, yeah, I bought this tool, I implemented, yeah, it passed testing, but it like what could say, is it doing what it is supposed to do? And I think that's where the notion of a continuous assessment, exercising your plans, it's essentially the only way to answer the multi-million dollar question. Are you, unfortunately, I'm not, are you ready to prevent an attack, but are you ready to respond when you are attacked? Because it's no longer a if but a when. And
Mhm.
if we take that mindset, so tying it into operational resiliency, you should be, so for example, if a boxer enters a ring, right? He knows he's gonna get punched. So train for absorbing those punches and carrying on the fight rather than expecting to wear a pair of white shorts and come out clean, right? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen like that. There's going to be blood. But I think with it starts with a mindset shift that if you know that it is inevitable, then your plans, your preparation has to cater for that. And I think it's only through exercising, whether it's a simulation, red team, purple team exercises, even basic procedural drills. Like most of most of the um, attacks can be mitigated to prevent catastrophic damage if people communicated early and discover it early. But we normally tend to overlook the simple stuff and place a lot of emphasis and priority on the high-end, sexier exercises. But then we fumble on the, okay, nobody knew about this for the last 6 hours. So the entire continuum of training has to come into play so that at the end of the day, it allows, whether it's the CISO, the CEO, this entire board, your clients, customers, to have that confidence that, okay, when the time comes, the teams are ready, and then hopefully they can have a better sleep at night.
Those are great points about the need for realistic exercises as well. I really like that analogy about the boxer in the ring. Um, you know, Chris, a lot of organizations in the finance industry are already performing pen testing and red teaming exercises to validate their security. But what can they be doing differently to better understand their threat readiness?
Yeah, I get that question a lot as well. I do a pen test, or I do red teams, or I do tabletop engagements, and those are wonderful engagements. I used to scope them for years when I worked for an integrator, all designed to ascertain what's the health and state of the actual organization today. Right, that's very, very important. But as I mentioned before, a pen test, a red team, they're point in time. That's the real problem. Is they're just once, maybe if you're lucky, twice a year. So they bring very limited value ultimately to a blue team and a sock team, primarily because of their limited run, and they never tell you how your tools respond. Right? They tell you the objective that was driven, what they achieved, if they captured the flag, whatever the use case would be for an internal or external pen test. But they never tell you how your investments are working. They never tell you the tools that you count on every day to defend and alert your organization to nefarious activities. Are they working? And that's a critical limitation of those, right? So don't forget as well, they're limited by your budget, unfortunately. So they're time limited and retesting is limited. I don't personally want to be the person making decisions on my environment and the health of my environment and my security posture and my risk solely based on those point in time assessments. You need a more proactive model. You need continuous validation, and do it really more of a thorough perspective, right? It has to be continuous, matching the threat landscape. If I'm not keeping up with the threat landscape, then I can't empirically answer the question, are we safe? Do our capabilities match the attacker? Have we filled the gaps Do we understand our security posture and our risk to our environment? And can we respond accordingly? So, how do you do that? You leverage a BAS tool to continuously challenge your environment. Let me give you an example. I was at a conference last week, and I won't mention the city. It was in a major city here in the States. And they were brought down for 3 days by Royal Ransomware. And they came over to my booth and they asked me, "Can you help us solve this problem?" And I said, "Actually, it's way simpler than you may imagine. If you had a breach and attack tool like Picus, you could have literally executed rural ransomware against your firewall and your endpoint, and in less than 4 minutes understood empirically, can I block, can I detect, can I log, and can I alert?" That's a significant time savings and cost savings over being breached, right? Being down as a city for 3 days because you couldn't defend against ransomware. There's a new way to do it today. There's a better way to do it. And it's not leveraging pen test and red teams. Let that be the litmus test of what you're doing on almost a daily basis. Let that not be the first time that you understand your security posture.
Great points. Really, really appreciate that example there. Um, you know, so Fernando, in many sectors, pen testing is driven heavily by compliance. What's the general view across the industry about manual versus automated approaches in the assurance that they provide?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Scott. So look, beyond the compliance, right, side of things, I think the industry is changing, right? We see a huge shift in the market, and our clients are also looking for, let's say, more proactive ways of identifying gaps, vulnerabilities, things that can be easily tackled, as you mentioned before. So, uh, not talking about rocket science, right? Sometimes like huge
Right.
cyber incidents they start with small, simple things, right? So we see our clients realizing that, let's say, the speed of change is too. I mean, there's too much things going on internally, right? Inside the companies, new products, new release, new technologies being used, and at the same time, on the other side of the equation, the attackers, right? So you need to be more proactive. You need to be more um, working on a continuous base, right? So that's where we see the market changing. But by the way, there is also more and more agencies talking about that today. So CISA just recognized the needs for automation, and this is the future happening now, right? So thankfully this is happening. So this changing mindset is happening for good. So yeah.
Got it. Nice. Yeah. Um, in Lester, I want to take the opportunity with your experience. I love to find out, people's recommendations for best practices. How regularly do financial firms need to validate the efficacy of their controls and their processes?
Well, if they don't have the privilege of what Creed has always mentioned, the breach and attack simulation, which is a continuous validation of your controls, then I'll propose like 4 different times where you should consider running either a complex tabletop exercise, diving into exact controls, getting all the correct people on the call. If not, run a red team simulation or purple team simulation. So there are 4 times to consider doing this. One, if you have a significant change in your leadership or makeup of your team. People assume handovers are done seamlessly. No, people get laid off on the notice. No idea where the documents are, no idea what the controls, the thresholds, and whoever whoever's left behind is left to pick up the slack. And I mean, we have seen even in post breaches, the entire teams are changed, right? And that's where I think if there's a significant change in the team or leadership, I think it's important to get everyone back on the same page. Give your leadership your guidance to what is critical, what's not critical. How do you expect your team to perform when they pick up certain anomalies? So I think that's an important time to do it. And I think the changeover in cybersecurity teams are it's I think it's higher turnover rate than majority of the other sectors. So I think that's one area to consider, because you can have all the best tools in the world. Who's operating the tools? People are operating the tools, and they need to be trained. They need to be leveled up. They need to understand the enterprise risk tolerance, so that they are able to then perform to mitigate the potential impacts. So that's one. Second is I think over the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a huge spend in onboarding new tools. Whatever's shiny and sexy has been purchased, but every time a new tool comes into play, there may be a change in how you defend, right? Although some people argue that, oh, if it's conceptually the same, then it should be fine. People will understand, but no, there's fine tuning. There is a signature that you have to update, and I think that when there's a change in tools, you should also look at, okay, how has this impact your controls? Has this impact your thresholds? And what does it mean for your partner teams, whether it's within security? And I think what's always overlooked is your technology partners. Most of the times, the security teams don't have full control of the tools, right? They require the technology teams to execute certain change. And therefore, once new tools are onboarded, that's another point in time to consider getting everybody back on the same page. The third time, which I think it is also important, is when there is a emergence of a new threat. And this, for example, if during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that was an opportune time to get everybody on the table and say, okay, this has just happened. Based on our known TTPs of the threat actor, this is the potential things that may happen, controlled or uncontrolled. We don't know. And therefore, that serves two things. One is to update everyone on the latest threat. And second is to ensure that your teams do their checks that, okay, based on this new knowledge, our tools updated to handle the potential attack. So that's another time. And I think the last time to consider running it is like a post-mortem of any incident. Then I think that's a good time to have a quick look again. Like, yes, there will be cleanup thereafter. There will be controls that will be amended and updated. Can we then go through the same pain again? And has that improved? Because if we can't even answer something that has happened, you can't even address something that has happened, whether it's to yourself or to a peer, then we're kidding ourselves, right? If we can't even do that. So I think those are 4 times. If you don't have a continuous breach and attack simulation tool to help you get a current assessment, then those are the 4 times that you may want to consider doing that.
That's great advice, a lot of wisdom there. And I just want to recap those: significant change of leadership, with new tools, when the threat has changed, or after a significant incident. Those are great. And Crit, we heard you talk about BAS. Could you give us a bit more insight into how that technology works and the type of outcomes that security leaders can expect from it?
Yeah, I would love to. It really is a concept of attacking yourself safely in production to ascertain what your posture is, your capabilities. Is my spend working? At a moment's notice, after running a simulation, you will know empirically with evidence, supported evidence, if you can block, if you can detect, if you're logging, if you're alerting appropriately with attacks that are being used to attack your company and other companies today in the wild. There's no need to sit back and wait or hope or presume. You can attack yourself and have answers to the test before game day, right? Quantify your capabilities quickly and easily. Most importantly, do it on a continual basis. The evidence and artifacts can be fed into your GRC team, right? Greatly enhancing audit results and capabilities. Know if your SOC is detecting or not detecting and pivot quickly into detection capabilities. Our BAS tool at Pickus is the only vendor that provides vendor-specific mitigations in the breach and attack simulation space today and vendor-specific detection queries. So you can dramatically decrease your time to detection and dramatically decrease your time to mitigation for the latest attacks. So it's a simple deployment. It's safe, non-destructive testing in a production environment where attackers attack you, by the way. I often hear, oh, let's do it in the lab. That's great. I can't remember the last breach I heard in a lab, right? So challenge your production environment, and you can do it safely with breach and attack simulation from Pickus.
Yeah. It's an excellent point about the lab. So we do have some questions here coming in from the audience. This first one, obviously AI is in the headlines a lot these days, and the question we've got here is how is AI changing the security landscape, both for attackers and defenders? So it's pretty broad. I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that first.
Yeah, I'll take a quick swing at it. I know from what I've seen and talking to clients and out in the field, and it's really still a lot of speculation, but I think we're zeroing in on the speculation and know what reality may soon look like. We know AI is changing our world. We know AI is changing almost every aspect of what we do, especially in cybersecurity. Does that have me worried as a defender? It does. Should it have the attackers worried about their ability to actually pull off successful attacks? It should. In other words, we will see AI tremendously change the landscape in the next very short period. I even hate to say few years, but we will see more sophisticated attacks. We will see new techniques and tactics that we hadn't even dreamed of or known about today. But yet, on the flip side, AI is vigorously being applied on the defender side. I think we will also see capabilities that we only dream about or speculate today coming to bear. I do not think, as most people do, that it will just eradicate defenders from their positions. It's hard to replace a human, but what we can do is greatly augment and scale their ability with AI. And I think it's going to change both ends of the spectrum sooner rather than later.
I think that's a great point. I mean, one thing that kind of goes to exactly that is I heard recently that there's already been work on a pen test GPT. So both for attackers and defenders. But Fernando, Lester, anything you want to add about what you're seeing with AI?
Yeah, I think it's the scary part is going to get noisy on both sides, right? And with noise, then it is back to the very, I don't know, hopefully not very manual, but discerning noise from actual sound. And I think that's going to be a challenge. And if we have looked, I think we all played around with, for example, ChatGPT. Just imagine the future of phishing campaigns. I can't even imagine how real it's going to be, and it's going to adapt and learn for how you respond to it, and that's going to be scary. And I don't know, it's going to be hard to teach people how to discern as well, right? If we don't know if we don't know how that's going to adapt, and if it's going to be so customized to the individual, then it's how, I don't know, how we're going to be learning how to outthink a robot in discerning what we think. I don't know. It's just going to get complicated and very noisy, and I think it's not going to be just. I think that's the problem with security. Every time we are nice and comfortable, a few years later something happens.
That's right. That's very right.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see the the full power, right, of AI, helping on the defensive side. When you think about machine learning and how things are evolving to be more efficient at the same time, you know, um, save on the people side and also on the inspections or evaluations, regardless if we're talking about a point in time or continuous validation, right? If we have something that's really adding value based on self-learning, with some input from, of course, the human side of things. So still, I think we are in early stage, but to Grit's point, I think this is very, very, it's something happening very soon. Yeah.
I'll
Interesting.
put it to you
Yeah.
a different way, Scott. I think the best defense against AI in the future will be AI. Right. So, I mean, we're going to see that on both ends. We're going to only rely on it more and more because as the nefarious actors leverage it, we will be leaning on AI to help us ascertain the sophistication of the attack, the ability to mitigate that attack. It's only coming at us like a freight train. So we either embrace it or we probably get run over.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that question. Another audience question: what are types of metrics organizations can use to best measure cyber resilience and demonstrate effectiveness to business leaders?
Well, I can take a stab on that one, Scott. So I would
Great.
say, of course, we need to understand where we stand today regarding our exposure, risk score across different multiple cybersecurity domains, from people, processes, technology, everything, right? So those metrics are, I would say, old school, but new ways of measuring them, if you will, a more data-driven approach in combination with continuous validation. That's the best in class these days. But also another important metric is what is the potential impact back to the business, right? If something bad happens, like if a threat actor is successful in doing some DDoS attack, right, or data breach. So quantifying potential losses is another very important metric these days, helping to communicate back to the business, what is the potential risk and making people uncomfortable. But it's a good way to demonstrate the needs for improvement. So again, measuring the defensive side, data-driven base, and also measuring the potential impact back to the business in a way that the business can understand and be sensitive about that. So those, in my opinion, are top of the list these days, Scott.
Great. Yeah. Hey, anybody else on that one?
No, I wouldn't say that's any particular matrix that would, I guess, increase or help measure that. But I think this as we get more rollout of operational resiliency, I think there is a greater need to identify what's really important, and then if that's really important, how many, I guess, levels of redundancy you need, alternative processing measures, and knowing. I think the first part is just knowing where your potential catastrophic systems are, and that would give you the ability to understand potential impact because I think the worst thing that happens in the attack, I think the first, I don't know, 4 hours, people are scrambling to understand, okay, what does this mean and what's the worst case scenario. And I think through the push out of operational resiliency, people are going to take another hard look at it, and with that, people will get a better understanding of, okay, what's really important. If we need to pool resources to protect or to stand up, prioritization, where does it go, where does it flow? So I think that's an important. I don't think companies are ready to give a number prioritization, right? Because business and business, you there will be no end to that conversation. But I think that entire exercise to really take a deep look at your processes, your dependencies, your unfortunately, your dependence on third party as well. That's all going to come into play. But that entire exercise would hopefully give you a clearer picture of where the potential crack lines are, so that you know where to shore up. And then if it does get impacted, then what are the fallback plans? Because we all know the traditional BCDR is, I don't know. I mean, it's got to adapt with times, and I think it's a good start for the industry to really embrace the role of operational resiliency, and there's a reason for that. Yeah.
Very good comment, Lester and Fernando. I really appreciate you being here with us today and sharing your time and expertise. I think I look at it from a risk perspective, likelihood, and impact. And I think what I see in organizations today is we have not ascertained very well what is the actual likelihood, right, of an event that then can cause impact. I think you have to start with more less subjective data, more empiric data, to really help quantify that better, to build a stronger foundation on that metric. There's a ton of metrics you could throw, right? I mean, what are the types of metrics? There are hundreds of pieces of data, but I like to break it down into simple things that are consumable: impact, likelihood, and impact. So what is my likelihood? Can I uncover that in a more empiric fashion today? You can, right? You can understand what's the likelihood of nefarious activity in your environment. Can you defend against it? Can you mitigate it? Do you have visibility into it to properly then quantify what your impact is going to be? So I think one without the other is difficult, but today I think we're really reliant on too much subjective data and not enough empiric evidence, right, to make data-driven decisions. Unfortunately, I still see a lot of organizations today making a lot of assumptions and not seeking evidence, right, to build the foundation for your risk quantification program. I see that in other tools, and I see that in programs. So I would just like to see people start with more empiric data that leads you to a quicker, clear, more concise decision based on data than roping in a lot of conjecture and subjective material. We start there, we'll be better off in our risk quantification efforts.
100%.
Well, Crit, I think that's probably a great place.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry, Scott. Just want to say yes, 100%
Yeah.
on what Crit just mentioned. And the good news is that these new ways of quantifying risks, using data, understanding both sides, threat landscape, defensive landscape, the correlation between attackers or TTPs versus which controls are in place or not in place, or how robust those controls are. The good news is that this is also a big change happening. I see this happening with my clients. I see this happening in my daily basis, right? So it's let's say next stage on the evolution for risk quantification, but this is happening, right? There is no turn back. So sorry, Scott, just want to
Agreed.
share that.
No, it's perfect. Good comment. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a good place to leave it. Maybe that's an even better place to leave it. But I appreciate all three of you coming on. Fernando, Lester, Crit, this has been a fantastic conversation. I found it really valuable. I think based on the questions the audience has as well. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, and a quick reminder that this is your last chance to grab that great white paper about key threats and cyber risks facing financial services and banking firms. That's in your handout section. And before we wrap up, as promised, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card is Navjot Kaur from Washington. So congratulations to Navjot Kaur. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Picus for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That's going to conclude today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.